So the second part of the diagnostic criteria looks at repetitive or idiosyncratic behavior. So that's your second sort of group. And you can see we're going to have at least 2 out of these 4, and we're going to go through these 4 in detail quickly. So the first one is repetitive or idiosyncratic behavior. Idiosyncratic means unusual. And it can either be something that is repetitive, so something that they're doing much more than would be usual, or something that they're doing that is a bit unusual that one's not used to. And important to understand that this is quite an important function that actually help autistic people cope. So some of these experiences, some of these movement things, for example, that they're doing is actually calming and comforting, and even enjoyable, because it actually helps with sensory integration. So stimming, which we'll talk about. So for example, movements where you stimulate your own proprioception, either through the feet or through the hands, for example, actually helps them to integrate information. And if you look in the OTs, for example, that work with autistic kids, will often give them lots of fidget toys. And they actually are encouraged to sit and fidget with stuff in class, because it actually helps them to focus better if they're actually able to stimulate their proprioception. So it helps them to regulate and even release emotion. It obviously can become problematic if it gets stuck in a loop. So it's a repetitive behavior, and that will be worse when they're very anxious. And in some contexts, some repetitive behaviors might not be appropriate. But this is quite often the thing that means that autistic kids often get bullied because of this. They get teased. So you'll find parents and teachers might, try and stop them from doing it because they say it disturbs the other children, or the other children are using it as reasons to bully. And so quite often, because of that, kids quite often end up being very anxious, very irritable, especially if they have to try and suppress these behaviors, and they can feel invalidated or ashamed or misunderstood because of these things that they feel they need to do. So these are not like tics, you can suppress them. And so again, especially in one-to-one interviews, and especially our girls more than our boys, who tend to internalize rather than externalize, they might suppress the need for some of these things they want to do, or find ways to do things that it doesn't seem so out of place. There's 3 different kinds of repetitive or idiosyncratic things we're going to look at. The first one is movements. So these are flapping, flicking the hands or fingers, swaying, rocking, spinning, pacing up and down. You can see, sometimes you see toe walking in adults, although quite common in your little kids. And then very sort of unusual movements that can include playing with hair, tapping a collarbone, rubbing something, picking at one's skin, tapping a tooth. So various little movements that people do. And there's a wide range of these, which are called self-stimulating behaviors and are often called stims. And the biggest thing they're doing is they are stimulating either your vestibular system or your proprioception system. And by stimulating those particular sensory neural pathways, it actually helps you to integrate other sensory pathways. They can also have a repetitive or atypical use of objects. And this is partly a way to, this categorization that's so difficult because the world is so chaotic. To help them make sense of the world, they like to order things. And so instead of play, you buy them lots of little cars. Instead of playing with the cars get lined up according to color, or get lined up according to size or things like that. But also playing with particular things. So turning lights on and off, ringing bells, repetitively opening doors, taking objects apart, not to figure out how they work, but just for the joy of doing that. But it can also be even reading the same book again and again and again, watching the same movie, literally years watching the same movie every week, a couple of times, kind of a thing. And the same song one listens to again and again and again. And I think because the sensory world is so overwhelming, this repetition helps to create a certain amount of security. But also making lists beyond just the practical use of lists, making lists excessively, making spreadsheets excessively with various color codings, and so helping ways to help them organize information beyond what is just useful. And then also repetitions within language and speech use. So one can get what they say unusual language use. So using strange words, using strange way of using words. Quite often in autistic kids, you might have a very unusually formal language, sound like a little professor. There's that series, Little Sheldon, using lots of big words and things like that. Or repetitive speech. There's quite a few of that in the movie Rain Man. And again, those very sort of stereotypical views of So repeating words after you've said something, repeating what you've said, repeating their own words, having a particular catchphrase or song or question that they come up repeatedly, even after that question has been answered. So the second section, so we've looked at repetitive and idiosyncratic movements. The section is flexibility, and particularly a challenge around flexibility. So lots of people, when they are anxious, also with lots of mental health conditions, struggle with flexibility. So just being inflexible doesn't necessarily mean you've got autism, but a lot of people with autism struggle with flexibility. And it partly has just to do with a real need for sameness. So yeah, if the world is, every time you work into a new environment, it's like you're starting from scratch. It's quite nice to stay in environments that always stay the same. So one has only so many executive functioning forces. And so rather than just do the same stuff and then there's less cognitive load than having to reprocess every new scenario. Choices is difficult when you're autistic because of this processing of information. So it's nice to know what to expect. So if they are going to go somewhere new, there's a lot of planning that needs to go into it. And very difficult to switch from one task to another. If I'm busy doing this, or this is what we're doing, difficult to now go into something new. So don't like to be interrupted. So the kind of behaviors we see then is this very much needing routines and rituals, very not liking small changes, not liking transitions. Some kids can be very strict about rules. You have to follow the rules, very upset if somebody else doesn't follow the rules. Some kids can get very perfectionistic and controlling of any scenarios. If they have a party, everything gets organized right down to the T. And these are all ways to try and make them feel a little bit more secure. But this kind of inflexibility can also affect the way that autistic people think sometimes. So they can sometimes be quite black and white on particular things, can get a bit stuck on that. They can have an extremely strong moral compass. And sometimes, and not all autistics, a lot of autistics have got an amazing sense of humor, but sometimes in some contexts, they can take a real literal interpretation of something that gets said or get done and can't read into what's going on behind it. This inflexibility, boys tend to externalize. So they will fight against things and become difficult and make issues, where the girls quite often might not say anything, but have huge internal anxiety. So we can't always just look at behaviors to tell you how flexibility is affecting that person. The third area is having intense or atypical interests. And there's quite a lot written about trying to understand this extraordinary ability to hyper-focus on a particular thing more so than neurotypical people. The DSM language is a bit confusing because it's vague. So firstly, there's an either or. You either have an intense interest in something or it's an atypical interest. So DSM uses the word abnormal. And we no longer like using sort of these negative connotations. So we prefer to use the word atypical. But it's basically, there's a certain fixation. So a particular thing, and it's not just about frequency, so how often do you engage with it, but also how intense do you engage with that particular interest when you're interested in it. So it's your internal experience of that interest. Restricted is a problematic term because it does not necessarily have to eclipse all. That's from in the DSM as well. So you can have several special interests that can change over time. And there's quite a big depth and breadth of knowledge. So for example, if you've got a kid who's very much into a particular video game, it will not just be about playing the video game, they will also know everything about the background of the video game, including who invented it, when, and will be a part of the whole fandom of that particular video game. So common things are animals, either a specific animal or just animals in general, reading, loving human science, human biology, interest in autism in itself can be a special interest. In languages, things like music, arts, crafts, science, there's a whole wide variety. And we see with the girls, quite often they have more animals and people will be more into those interests, and the boys might be more objects and things, but there's no rules at all. And again, there's been a problem that people have tried to sort of define what those kinds of interests are. Not having a special interest or trying to take that special interest away can feel similar to a depression for autistics. It's sort of a lifeline in a world where there's so much information, so much coming in, having something that one knows so well and gets really interested and excited about. And there's a lovely word, is Chloe Hayden. She's an autistic actress from Australia. She's in the series Heartbreak High, where she plays an autistic girl. So she's an autistic actress playing an autistic girl. And in her book, she talks about eye sparkles as these special interests that autistic people have. So the last big category, and that one is, we've mentioned earlier, about 90 to 95% of autistic people will have differences in how their senses are activated. And so some of them can have quite severe sensory discomfort. And this is not the same as being sensitive to light, in your eyes, or being just sensitive to the noise hurting you physically. It's actually an emotional overwhelm that happens. So they actually have experiences of anxiety or panic or overwhelm or even anger and irritability with an over reactivity of particular sense organs. So it has a huge impact on one's ability to function, especially if you think how noisy our world is. Just think of your average mall or your average Ward 5 OPD, for example. It's extraordinary how much information one's constantly bombarded with. But also, remember, it also affects your internal senses, like your proprioception and your sense of balance. So it can also have an effect on the way you move. So there's 8 different senses that gets described in the DSM. So there's the 5, your hearing, your taste, your smell, your visual and touch. And then there's your 3 internal senses, which is your sense of balance, your sense of movement, but also your ability to know where you're hungry or thirsty, your sort of inner physiology. So any of those senses can either be over-responsive, so you are taking in too much information, and it'll be different in different autistic people which organs are over-responsive. And this can lead to, if they get too overwhelmed, this can lead to meltdowns or unusual responses, avoidance of things, or certain sort of internal reactions to all this information. Or they can be under-responsive, and there's usually a combination. So some being under-responsive, some being over-responsive. And for every single autistic person, there'll be like a different configuration, which means they will behave very differently depending on what that is. You also get sensory craving, and this is a little bit to do also with that stimming, where some senses actually you like to activate and are keen to or are interested in activating those senses. And also it's interesting, for example, with noise, you might be sensitive to one type of noise. So for example, going to a club where the music is blaring might be fine, but going to a restaurant where there's lots of different noises might be more overwhelming. So it's not as simple as just too much or too little. So responsivity, we'll just mention a few of these quickly. You can be over-responsive to specific sounds, to specific light. Touch is quite a big thing. So particular textures, can't have tags in the t-shirts, struggle with bath time and toothbrush time because don't like the experiences of those touch. Be averse to particular smells, be averse to particular reactions to food. So both the textures of food and the taste of food means that quite a lot of autistic people have a lot of food restrictions in what they can eat. Getting very overwhelmed in any crowds or groups. And an over-responsivity to things like pain, for example. So being very pain sensitive. And if they've got a balanced sense that's very overactive, they can have a huge issue with even slight differences in height or certain movements. So they can't do swings at all, for example, or go on roller coasters at all. Under-responsivity is where the senses are not so active, so low reaction to pain or temperature or noticing internal signals such as hunger or thirst. If they don't have very good touch, don't notice touch, they might not notice if there's food on the face, or they haven't brushed their hair, or they're not wearing pants. So sometimes you have this sort of the typical absent-minded professor picture could be part of that. Some of them might just not be very good at noticing things either visually or auditory, which can be an issue with danger things. And then quite common is that a lot of people with autism or autistic people have poor postural control due to proprioception issues. And so you have dyspraxia. So struggling, walking into things, tripping over things, struggling to find their direction and things. But also if they don't have very good vestibular input, they can also be oblivious of risks of things like heights, and some of them don't even become dizzy when they're spinning. And then sensory craving is just sometimes particularly liking, like smelling or touching things, but the classic one is liking spinning lights or spinning washing machines or even spinning doors, and being able to find that sort of activating particular senses actually helping to calm other senses down, and chewing and sucking on things. So there is even autistic things you put on the back of pencils so they can chew on that, or things they can wear around their neck to chew on, and that also helps them to integrate. So where does that get us now? So the DSM criteria is very simple. We have all our criteria there. And the reality is, the moment in public sector probably doesn't help us very much, because our challenge is in terms of what do we do when we suspect it. So it's good to be open to the possibility, and any of your patients has got a mental health diagnosis. So if you've got somebody who's got, or, who's got anxiety or depression, but especially if you're sitting somebody who's really struggling, high school kids struggling at school, for example, behavioral problems, dyspraxia, learning difficulties, to just consider maybe this person might actually be also autistic. It's important to understand that the only way to diagnose it is to understand what their internal experience of the world is, not necessarily the external behaviors, because of masking and camouflaging, for example. And so the way they do this assessments in private is through a whole set of surveys and questionnaires and through an interview. And the interview is trying to identify what that person is experiencing, rather than trying to look at them and observe them, and through your observations decide if somebody's autistic. So actually somebody has to be able to tell you what they're experiencing, to be able to tell they're autistic, rather than just doing your own observations. And so it's quite an extensive interview, several hours. They also will then talk to teachers, they'll talk to family members, they'll talk to other people to be able to get a better idea of this. In the public sector, so I think our psychologists do assessments for children autism, but I don't think they're very practiced in adult autism. Occupational therapists might be an option as well, and that's one of the things I'll have a little bit of an exploration here to find out a little bit what access we have to helping people just with a diagnosis. And the aim is not to now try and there's no treatment for autism. We don't want to treat autism, but the biggest gift you can give somebody with autism is them being able to understand how their way of processing information is different than the neurotypical world, and why therefore it trips them up. And it gives us a better way also to be able to communicate to your family or to your partner, this is why I need this particular region routines, this is why I stim, this is what is important to me. And there's a wide range of support groups and online communities available actually to help people that are autistic. So some of the common occurring challenges, and we'll just do these very, very briefly. So the challenge with living with autism is this massive emotional impact. And so we do see a lot of